characteristic in that they're what's known as areas beyond national jurisdiction. So they're areas that are outside the normal control of countries in the way that we know it. So if you're in Tassie, if you're in New South Wales, Victoria, if you go off the coast of any of these states, you're within the legal control of the country or the particular state, whether it's Tassie or New South Wales or Queensland. But if you look at the oceans, you look at space, you look at Antarctica, they're all a bit different. They're not under that sort of clear legal control of a particular country. Okay, so that's why I'm sort of interested in these particular areas. So what I want to do today is this is some material that I've sort of worked into some of the law courses and courses at IMAS about space law. Okay, so it's the material essentially that I give to master's students or law students about space law to try and hook their interest on space law. Tassie is actually, I'm speaking to an audience here that already know this, I reckon, but Tassie is particularly well situated for space research. And we've got some of the most important infrastructure for radio astronomy in the country. And also space situational awareness radar system that the university and Defence Department and others are involved in. So there's some really important space research and space infrastructure in our part of the world. So I reckon our young people at university here need to be more aware of that and aware of space law, okay? And one of the reasons for that is, this is a quote from the previous minister in the previous government who was very excited by all this. I think the current government's a little less excited. They're more interested in other things. But certainly the Morrison government was very excited about the space industry here in Australia. They were talking, figures, of around 350 billion globally for the space industry. But it was predicted to really sort of explode over the next 5 to 10 years. So it's actually something for young people that I teach that they can get into as lawyers and actually work, in government, in private consulting on space law. So it's good, for that reason. So that's why I get into the courses. Look, I always start, and this might be telling the ABC to this audience, but I'll say it anyway, just in case, just so I don't leave anyone behind. Just some fundamentals about space history before we actually look at what the international law does to try and regulate space. I think it's fair to say that, if you look back into human history, if we go back to the Greeks, and the Greek astronomers, humans have been staring into the night sky, from time immemorial. It's been happening for thousands of years. Even now, we hear with the sort of focus on Indigenous knowledge, which is, very popular at the universities at the moment. Even stories about, Indigenous knowledge of the night skies and these sort of things. So, humans have been looking at the night sky and interacting with it in that way for, thousands and thousands of years. But the trouble to do anything more than look at it was, of course, the problem of gravity, that it takes a lot of energy to get outside the Earth's gravity and to get into orbit or further out into space. And in fact, to leave the Earth's gravity, you're essentially got to be travelling 11 kilometres per second or 40,000 kilometres per hour. And in order to do that, of course, that's something that has only been very recent in human history. Really the last 100 to 150 years, the discovery of fossil fuels, the ability to sort of concentrate those into rocketry, all that sort of technology is just a tiny blink of the eye in terms of human history. Okay, so we are lucky enough to live in that period where humans, not only can look at the night sky but can actually get out beyond gravity into orbit and into space. But this is something totally rare in human history. Okay, so if we go back and have a look at some of the really recent history on this of the last 100 years, the rocketry really only started to develop in a significant way in the 1920s and 1930s through the work of people like Robert Goddard, the American rocket scientist. It got a kick on, of course, during the 1930s and 40s with the Germans, of course. This was the period of the Nazi period of World War II, and rocket scientists like von Braun, the famous German rocket scientists who ended up living in America post-World War II, did a lot of work to improve rocket engines, such that the Germans were able to develop rockets for use in World War II, the V2 rocket, which the Germans used as a type of intercontinental missile, which bombed London and other cities from Germany during World War II. So that technology that was developed during World War II really set up after World War II the possibilities of getting outside of the Earth's orbit through better technology in rocketry, and that was of course taken up post World War II, not by the Germans because they were in disarray, having lost World War II, but of course by the Americans in particular and the Russians. Okay, one of the first things that the occupying American and Soviet forces did in Germany at the end of World War II was to round up all the best rocket engineers and take them back home. So the Americans scooped up von Braun and others. The Russians got some of their top rocket engineers as well and took them back and treated them well and gave them research labs and said, go to it. We want you to develop your rocketry, because they both knew the importance of that in terms of what was to come. And really, during this period of the 1950s, as we come out of the early World War II period, you had this race going on between the Russians or the Soviets and the Americans. Who's going to get into space first? Who's going to get into orbit first? Who's going to put a human being in space first? So, of course, we know the Russians were first, of course, in 1957. In October, when they launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite in space. This was a great dent to American pride at the time, because the Americans were developing two rocket programs, one under what was to become NASA, one under the military, trying to get a satellite up to be the first, but the Russians got in front. The Russians then launched the second one a few months later in November 1957, which actually had a dog in it. Remember the dog Laika, the first animal in space. And again, the Americans were behind. The Americans, not until the following year, in 1958, launched their first satellite, Explorer 1. But of course, the Russians then in 1961 beat the Americans again, getting the first person into space, Yuri Gagarin. And then, of course, it wasn't until a month or so later, the Americans got up Alan Shepard. So the Americans are running second all the time during this early period of the space race, and really didn't get in front of the Russians until later that decade, after the Kennedy administration had funded the Apollo 11 mission and put the first human on the moon, of course, Armstrong and Aldrin. So yeah, this is very recent history. We roll forward to the 1980s. Of course, we had the first space shuttle and the space shuttle program. And then more recently, about 25, 30 years ago, the launch of the International Space Station, which, of course, I'm sure you all know can be seen quite readily in the night sky, over Tasmania here. So this, is another landmark of an international cooperation on space, with a consortium of countries being the European Union, or the group of countries in the European Union, the US, Russia, Canada, and Japan, all agreeing in that post-Cold War period of the early 1990s to fund and set up, this very important piece of space infrastructure, all under treaties, all under an agreement between those countries. When I say treaty, essentially mean an agreement between countries, okay? That's what I mean by a treaty. So that's all set up sort of 25 years ago. And of course, the ISS is still up there. So, amazing piece of international cooperation through international law that's given rise to that, that we see, as I said, in the night sky here in Hobart every day if we've got the right weather conditions. Of course, the other thing which is really important is the what's known as the low Earth orbit or near space environment from the Earth. And again, people in this room will probably know all this, but I'll just say quickly anyway. Satellites are superbly important now in terms of all aspects of our lives. And we have now nearly 10,000 satellites in orbit around the planet. Most of them in what's called low Earth orbit, which is essentially from 200 to 2,000 kilometres from the Earth. But other satellites, about 3% of them out in the 12% out in the geostationary orbit, which is particularly good for telecommunications, and some others in between in what's known as middle Earth orbits. So these are, this is the huge amount of human infrastructure circling the planet at high speed at various distances out from the Earth. So this is fundamental to our phones, our telescopes that operate on GPS systems and similar systems. This is all very fundamental to the way we live in terms of our built infrastructure, traffic lights, you name it. It all relies upon this huge infrastructure of space equipment. So that means that now more than ever, but certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, it was recognised by countries that as human beings have got out of the Earth's orbit for the first time, got the technology to be able to do that, that we needed some sort of order to be created as to how states would behave, how countries would behave in space, okay? And it was particularly important to do that, given or to establish that order, that what was going to happen in terms of the way countries would behave, particularly what was going on in the world in a wider sense, because that 1950s and 1960s period that I mentioned, the Sputnik period and the period of the moon landing in the late 1960s, was a particularly difficult time for the world. This was what was known as this Cold War period of particular and strident competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. It was an ideological struggle over, which way the world should be run, whether by the communist system of the Soviets or the kind of capitalist system of the United States. The world basically divided into two, and there was this big struggle going on in a military sense. We had the development of nuclear weapons as well. In World War II, the Americans used them on Japan in 1945. The technology was leaked out to the Soviets in the late 1940s. So the Soviets had nuclear weapons by 1949. So there was this real worry as to who's going to get the jump on each other in terms of that technology and the ability to strike first on the other. Okay, so you had this arms race building up in the 1950s and 1960s, which was happening at the time that this rocketry was allowing humans to get into space as well. And so the military planners in the United States and Soviet Union knew whoever got into space first and got into orbit first could potentially have the ability to get a nuclear weapon into orbit and to circulate it around and drop it whenever they would want to, okay? And the country that had dropped it on would be defenceless. There would be no, anti-ballistic missiles or anything that could deal with that issue, okay? So whoever's getting into space first is already got a big strategic jump on the other. And so that's the space race was not just a technological struggle of who's got the best system to get into space. It was also a deep and important strategic military struggle, okay? And that's why the Americans were so, caught off guard when the Soviets did it first, okay? So both of them realised the vulnerability of the other to a nuclear weapon going into orbit, okay? So they both saw the necessity to get together and create an order as to what would happen in space, okay? Luckily, both were they were in deep competition, but sensible enough to be able to see that, okay? So that's why we got international space law, and we got it quite quickly and effectively compared to the way international law forms these days, which is a lot more painful and a longer process. Okay, so we'll go into the law that we got in the 1960s onwards through to the 1980s over a 15-20 year period in a minute. But before I do that, just a threshold, I guess, legal issue as to where space starts. So where does international space law start, and where does, Earth law stop? Okay. Has anyone got any ideas about that? Like, what, if we're looking at, say, Australian, domestic law on controlling aircraft, Qantas flights, Virgin flights, whatever. Yeah. How far up does that go? It is, yeah. 100 kilometres. Okay, good guess. Okay. Yeah, look, the short answer to this is that there's no international agreement between countries as to where national law or domestic law stops and space law starts. Okay. Unfortunately, in an ideal world, there would be, right? But there's not. Different countries have different views on this and they haven't been able to agree on it. Okay. Australia says 100 kilometres above the ground. It's what's known as the Kármán line, or von Kármán line. He was one of these rocket scientists, and that's why it's named that. And it's essentially the spot where jet engines stop working. Okay, so it kind of makes sense that if you can't take aircraft above that 100-kilometre line, then the air's too thin. That's where space should start. Okay. But Australia, Denmark, and several other countries, China, I think, to an extent, buys into this 100-kilometre limit or boundary, but other countries don't. The United States says 88 kilometres. Other countries like Russia, they're kind of ambiguous about it. They're not that clear, but they say sometimes 20, 25 kilometres. That's where most commercial airliners stop flying above. They don't get much higher than that. So that they sort of said, oh well, that should be the the boundary of space or national airspace and outer space. But certainly from an Australian point of view, it's in our domestic law. So there's a piece of legislation in 2018 about launches of space objects that's in our domestic law, federal legislation, Commonwealth legislation. So it says in there that a space object is something that's designed to go above 100 kilometres. So that's the sort of indicator, from an Australian point of view, our domestic law treats, Australian law going up to 100 kilometres, but after 101 kilometres, you're in outer space and there's no more Australian law. Okay, so that's the boundary. It was very relevant. You might remember, before I leave that point, this is what drives it home. You might remember early last year there was a big kerfuffle in the media about Chinese weather balloons drifting across the United States. Remember that? Yeah, weather balloons in inverted commas. The Americans said they were spy balloons, right? And the Chinese said, no, they're weather balloons that got off the leash and they've drifted over there. So, who knows what the truth is about all that. But the one thing is they're at about 40 to 45 kilometres. So they're in that zone between, say, 20 to 25 and 100, right? So depending on what view you take of domestic law applying in that area determines, the legal rights and law that can be projected in terms of those balloons. So say, the Russians, for instance, would say, oh, well, that's in space. So, if it drifts across the United States, or too bad the United States have just got to put up with it, just like a satellite going at 150 kilometres, the Americans can't say anything about that because it's in space, right? So it's a question of how far down you can go towards the ground, and when you're putting things, going around the planet, this is where this definition becomes all important, okay? If it came over Australia would say, no, well, that's in Australian domestic airspace. That's, you need permission of Australia, us in order to do that, okay? And the Americans ultimately did as well, because they shot it down, I think, when it went over the Atlantic and it landed in the water, and they've captured it and pulling it apart or whatever. So anyway, so that's a fundamental distinction. Where does Australian or domestic law stop? Where does space start? From our point of view as Australians, 100 kilometres, okay, above the surface. Okay, so if we're going to take creating order between states, that is regular patterns of behaviour between states in space, and we take space to be above 100 kilometres, how did it happen? What did the US and the Soviets do to create that order and regularity in terms of the way they behave? Well, it sort of started early on in the 1960s. In 61, there was a UN General Assembly resolution through the United Nations, which was put together by the Soviets and the Americans. Resolution 1721, International Cooperation on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Okay, peace, non-militarisation was very much the original theme, because they were both worried about putting a nuclear weapon up and being able to drop it, right? And the other country being defenceless. So you'll see the language in here, recognising the common interests of mankind in furthering peaceful uses of outer space. The believing the exploration and use of outer space should only be for the betterment of mankind and for the benefit of states. Commends the following. In 1A, that international law, including the chapter of the United Nations, applies to outer space and celestial bodies. Outer space and celestial bodies are free for exploration and use by states in conformity with international law and not subject to international appropriation. So a few things here. From the get-go in 1961, it's agreed that space above 100 kilometres, okay, is not a lawless zone. It's not a wild west, an anarchy of there are no rules, do what you want. Okay, all countries are saying that international law applies out there as much as it does here on Earth. Okay, so that's the first thing, including the UN Charter. And the UN Charter, has rules saying that no country will attack another unless in no country will use force against another unless in self-defence. Okay, someone needs to remind the Russians about that in the last few years, but anyway, that's the basic rule. Okay, you don't use force against another state unless you're defending yourself, right? So that sort of stuff goes into space. Okay, doesn't stop at 100 kilometres. Similarly, the idea of peaceful use, so restrictions on militarisation. Also, what we've got here about that no national appropriation, no claiming, sovereignty claiming in space. Okay, so you don't go up and put a flag and say this is mine. Okay, despite the fact there are websites in the United States that have been going for 30 or 40 years, where some cranks in the United States sell parts of the moon and parts of planets to people for $100 or so. You get a certificate saying that's you've got title to that. Total nonsense, right? The treaties say that the United States, the place where those certificates are sold, can't appropriate, any part of space, right? So, non-appropriation, peaceful use, international law going into space. Again, in 1963, a couple of years later, another UN General Assembly resolution, 1884. Again, indicating the Soviet Union, United States intention not to station in outer space any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. They had this idea, some of the military planners in the US, of these rods of steel, so like a satellite with these giant cast iron rods, and so you don't have a nuclear weapon space. You have this, and it's circling around, in an hour and 20 orbit or whatever it is. Depending on where it's placed. And then at some point, if you release these big cast iron rods that fall down and go through don't burn up because they're made of such tough iron. They come through the atmosphere at high speed and land on cities, and they're like nuclear bombs. They explode like nuclear bombs, right? So they're very creative, these these military planets, right? So you can't put military weapons in space. Let's have giant iron rods, right? So these sort of ideas, they wanted to kind of agree that no one would do that, okay? So again, this is what they did in 1963 with this General Assembly resolution. We're not going to place any of these things in orbit around the Earth any nuclear weapons, any kinds of weapons of mass destruction. And also, we're not going to install them on celestial bodies. So, the moon, let's say, or other planets, or station such weapons in outer space, okay? So, having said all that, okay, the non-militarisation agreements that's reached here that ends up in the Outer Space Treaty, which we'll talk about in a minute, certainly does not stop any sort of surveillance or spying or use of the near space environment for military communications. That was happening from the get-go, right from the late 1950s, early 1960s onwards. As soon as they both got their initial satellites up there, the next step was the military saying, great, now we get cameras up there. So all this sort of strategic camera work from satellites is the development of satellite technology during the 1960s. Okay, it's not for science, it's not for peaceful purposes. It's for getting your camera over and looking at where missile silos are being constructed and where military bases are. That's what it's all happening in the early 1960s. Okay, so the non-militarisation is a constrained non-militarisation. Right, but what we did get in terms of treaties, agreements, after those two UN General Assembly resolutions in 1961 and 1963, was the 5 space law treaties, okay, which run from 1967 through to 1979, which is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. That's like the kind of constitution of space. It's the main agreement, the Outer Space Treaty. That's the one I'll spend the most time on in a minute. The next year we got what's known as the Rescue Agreement to do with rescuing astronauts. 4 years later, we got the Liability Convention, some rules as who's going to pay if something goes wrong in launching space vehicles or colliding space vehicles into each other in space. And then a year later, we got the Registration Convention, which is essentially to register so we know what's up in space. And then 4 years later, in 1979, we got the Moon Treaty, which is the last one. So the last piece of treaty law we got in space was in 1979. Okay, so this is the late period of Jimmy Carter's administration in the United States, or before Bob Hawke was elected here in Australia. Okay, so these treaties have been agreed a long time. They were agreed quite quickly, in a 12-year period essentially, and they set the foundations for that order in space as to how countries will behave. Okay, and for the most part, countries have, not only agreed to this, but also not misbehaved in terms of, going against these rules. Okay, so these rules have been very helpful. Okay, so let's look at the Constitution, or the Bible, let's say, of outer space law, being the Outer Space Treaty. If we look at the content of that treaty, what we see is the following. These are the key provisions. Article 1 of the treaty up front says that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic and scientific development, and shall be for the province of all mankind. Okay? So the benefit of all countries. So there was this concern by developing countries that they were going to miss out because they couldn't, get up into space. They didn't have the technology. It's really only the Americans, the Soviets, and the French were getting involved at that point. So this language starts to creep in about developing countries, making sure they're not left out. That's really important in the Moon Treaty, which we'll get to in a minute. The outer space, the moon, celestial body should be free for exploration. Okay, all countries should have freedom of exploration on the basis of equality in accordance with international law, freedom of access to all celestial bodies. Okay, no one's going up planting flags, roping off areas, restricting scientific investigation in outer space. Okay, so it's a bit like the Antarctic Treaty in that way. In fact, the Outer Space Treaty was seen to be like draw a lot of its inspiration from the Antarctic Treaty. Okay, neutralise conflict in the region, or potential conflict, and allow everyone to go there and do science and use it for peaceful purposes. So similar type of thinking in Article 1. Article 2 says that the outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation. So no claims of sovereignty by means of use or occupation. Okay, so no claims. Okay, similar to the Antarctic Treaty. It sort of stops any new claims. There were 7 claims made up until 1959, including the Australian claim, the biggest one. But after 1959, no new claims whilst the treaty's in place, okay? Similar thing here. Article 3, the parties to the treaty shall carry on activities in exploration and use of outer space in accordance with international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, and interest in maintaining international peace and security. Okay, so this is this idea that, you know, law doesn't stop at 100 kilometres or where national law stops. International law follows countries into space. Strangely, these days, people, I think, you know, Elon Musk and some of these sort of, you know, space entrepreneurs don't seem to want to read that or understand it. They, you know, the way they talk sometimes is, oh, you know, if we get to Mars, you know, what law will apply, you know, and try to suggest it'll be, you know, some new legal system which will be set up by the colonists, which will be the companies that they own, etc. No, you know, those companies are all resident in the United States, so they're US companies. If they or the US government or anyone else gets to Mars, the law, international law applies in terms of the way they behave, okay? Yeah, you know, that's yeah, that's a good point. We'll come to that at the very end. There's some special provisions in the Moon Treaty about that. Okay, but the Moon Treaty has only got limited coverage. Okay, the United States is not in it. Basically, with resource extraction on the Moon and asteroids and other celestial bodies, if a country's not in the Moon Treaty, such as the US and China, the position is that they're not able to appropriate, so claim the particular area, but the way that's interpreted is they're still allowed to mine it or to bring it back to Earth, okay? So, yeah, so resource extraction is not prohibited, but trying to rope off areas and say no one else can go in there is, okay? If that makes sense. Yeah, and I mean, water crystals are the big valuable thing on the Moon in the poles, because if you get water, you separate water into hydrogen and oxygen, and you can power rockets with hydrogen and then shoot them off towards Mars. So that's one of the, yeah, so that sort of stuff, you know, the way it's been interpreted, certainly the Outer Space Treaty is allowable, okay? Yeah, but the Moon Treaty has some special rules about that, which we'll get to at the end. Yeah, look, you would think so, right? But certainly the way the big dogs, the main players, the Soviets in the US and all the major space powers have interpreted that. They interpret it in a way that doesn't prevent resource extraction. It's more the view that anyone can get in and extract resources. You just can't hold anyone out. Do you know what I mean? By saying it's mine. So you can't put a fence around it and put a flag and say no one's to come here. Anyone can come there and they can do scientific research and or resource extraction. Okay? Yeah, I know.
I can see the Expanse scenario. If you watch that series, The Expanse.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
I can see that.
There's another one for All Mankind on Apple TV, which was very good on this as well. Yeah. The language is a bit dated for the ladies in the audience. I know. In fact, you can say humankind these days. You know, this is 1960s language, but yeah, no, it's definitely a coming issue. Okay. But no one's to put a fence around and plant a flag. Okay. Each party who launches or procures launching of an object into space is internationally liable for damage. Okay. So if you're going to shoot it up there and something goes wrong, it's on you as the launching state. We'll come to a bit more on that in a minute. Also, Article 8. Each state party will set a registry up as to what objects are launched into space and shall retain jurisdiction and control over such object, okay? So if a country launches a satellite or a spaceship in space, the law of that country goes with that object, okay? So it's a bit like, you know, flying on a plane when you go to Europe, you know, if it's a German plane, Lufthansa plane, Once you get outside of Australian airspace, you're then in German law because you're on a German plane. It's the same thing here. Okay, so it's not a lawless space. So if someone decides to assault someone on a spaceship, there is domestic law that applies there. And then Article 9, in the exploration use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, countries will be guided by the principle of cooperation and mutual assistance, due regard for the interests of other states. And Article 12 is really interesting. There's an inspection right there. So any country can go to any installation, piece of equipment, space vehicle on the moon or any other celestial body and ask to look at it and inspect it. Okay, that's the same as in the Antarctic Treaty. Okay, any country, including Australia, can go to any other research station, any ship, any aircraft in the Antarctic area and say, I want to have a look. Okay, and we do.
I'll be happy with that because of the simple difficulty in doing it.
Yeah, a bit more harder in space, I agree. Yeah. Well, it's pretty hard in Antarctica too. They don't do it every year. They only do it every probably 4 or 5 years, even us. So, yeah, this is the problem of these, dark, remote, dangerous places, right? Yeah. But anyway, so that's essentially the Constitution or the Bible of space law. What you heard there. What happened the following year? We got the Rescue Agreement, which builds on the idea in Article 5 of Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the obligation to treat astronauts as envoys of all humankind, and to render assistance to astronauts that are in accident, distress, or emergency. So this obligation, applies not only in space, some of the space movies, I think, with George Clooney and Sandra Bullock. It's not only that situation that, if astronauts get into trouble while they're in orbit, you've got an obligation as a space country to render assistance. A bit like, ships on the high sea, similar sort of rule. But also, if you get a launch and there's a failure and your rocket fails, the astronauts end up, bailing into the ocean and land off your coastline or in high seas areas where you've got a ship nearby. As a country which is party to the treaty, you've got an obligation to go and pick them up and return them back to their own country and not hold them and interrogate them and, you fill them full of truth serum or whatever, So remember, this is the Cold War, right? So, the idea, those things were in the minds of the Soviets in the United States, okay? So that's the way the Rescue Agreement was set up. All, US, Soviets, other countries that came on board, would help astronauts return them in space, on Earth, get them back to their home country if something goes wrong, okay? Kind of makes sense. 4 years later, the Liability Convention. These are the rules that set up who's going to pay when something goes wrong. So essentially, if you look at Article 7 of the Liability Convention builds on Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, which effectively said that each state party to the treaty that launches or procures launching of an object into space shall be internationally liable for any damage to another state party, whether this occurs in airspace or outer space. So essentially what it sets up a liability regime where the launching state, and that can be the state that either launches, shoots the rocket from their territory, procures launching, so engages another country to shoot a rocket from the second country's territory. So whether you launch it yourself or you pay someone else to launch it from another country, you're the launching state and you've got liability. And there's an absolute liability, so there's no excuses at all, in other words, if during the launch you hit an aircraft in flight, or if your rocket veers off and lands on another country and causes damage, right? No excuses, absolute liability, you've got to pay the damage, right? Then once you get into space, there's a fault-based scheme where if you cause damage in space, you have to show fault. So it's a bit like our road rules here, that if you run up the back of someone, that's your fault, you've got to pay. But if you can't tell whose fault it is, then you mightn't have to pay, right? So it's a similar sort of system to what that operates in space, okay? So if you have two satellites collide, if a spacecraft collides with a spacecraft or collides with a satellite, it'd be a question of showing who's at fault, okay? And that'd be checking in terms of navigation, you know, and all those sort of, pardon? Yeah, get dash cams. That's right. You have to pull out the dash cams and see who was driving poorly. So yeah, so that's why we. No, there won't be insurance companies involved. In fact, there'll be the one claim that has been made under the liability convention was in 1978. So some might remember this. I was a kid at the time and interested in these things, but I can't quite recall it. But what it was in 1978, the Soviets launched a military satellite called Cosmos 954 into orbit, and it was in September they launched it. About 4 months later, something went wrong. It depressurised and began to deorbit. Okay. And a few days later, it came down through orbit and broke up over northwestern Canada. And because it broke up, it was a nuclear-powered satellite, so it had a little nuclear reactor on board for power. It broke up over 320-odd thousand square kilometres in Canada. Okay, so the Canadians were deeply cranky about this because you had potential nuclear waste spread over a large part of Canada. Okay, so the Canadians got in touch with the Soviet government and made a claim under the Liability Convention. They had a 12-month period to do that. You'd have to get their claim in within 12 months. And the Soviets got the claim for $6 million worth of cleanup costs. That was what the Canadians calculated the cleanup costs they expended. And then 4 years later, after some toing and throwing of diplomatic negotiations, the Soviets settled it for $3 million Canadian dollars. Okay, so there you had an international dispute about application of the Liability Convention, which resulted in a peaceful resolution of that dispute. So, you know, this has, you know, importance in terms of. That was around the same time. I do remember that. Yeah, that was late 70s, wasn't it? Skylab, yeah.
Space station that they.
Yeah, and yeah, they would have done it voluntarily. Yeah, well, they would have done it voluntarily because of our good relations with the US. But yeah, strictly speaking, you know, Australian government could have brought a claim under the Liability Convention, perhaps made a formal demand on the US, and then negotiated a settlement, and then the money would have flowed back down, hopefully from the government, back down to the council to clean up. Littering, yeah. Yeah, I do remember Skylab. Yeah, everyone was really worried it was going to drop on their house, remember? Because it was meant to go over Australia. Yeah. But the registration convention in 75, that was the last of the fourth of the space law treaties. Essentially sets up an international register of objects launched into outer space. It's held by the UN. Every launch state that launches an object into space needs to register it on that registration log, so that countries know essentially what's in space, so they can use it for navigational purposes and to try to avoid running into each other. So yeah, again, makes perfect sense. So yeah, you had, you know, an order of, you know, an order created as to the way the key spacefaring states, the US, Soviet Union, France, Japan, etc., was coming into it by then, were going to behave and treat each other, okay? And even with the Soviets, even in the late 70s, you know, relations weren't good with them then, as they're not great now. They still, you know, met their obligations under the Liability Convention, okay? So, you know, this is important work that's been done here. With the resource extraction issue, remember I said that the Moon Treaty had some special rules on this. The Moon Treaty is the last one, the fifth treaty, space law treaty, agreed in 1979. And the reason it is different is that this is the time in the world when the developing countries have come out of the colonial period. So you've got a lot more developing countries. We only had 54 countries in the world just after World War II. And then by the late 1970s, we've got well over 100. So you've got all these new countries. They've got governments and their own identity, and they're on the international stage in the UN, and they're kind of banging their fist on the table about, the developed world having, exploited them in this colonial system, and they want their time in the sun or some payback, okay? Part of that was these demands which were put on the developed world for better trade relations in the trade treaties, so more preferential trade for agricultural products into the West, and less protection of French farmers and others behind tariff walls. So there was all that sort of stuff going on. But the other part was this idea of the common heritage of mankind. And so this was a legal principle that the developed countries really pushed at the time. The developing countries really pushed at the time. And the idea was that if anything's going to happen in these areas beyond national jurisdiction, whether that be the deep seabed, which is out the ocean floor out beyond areas of national jurisdiction, or whether it be in space, say on the moon, if there's to be any mining in these areas, then it's only developed countries that are going to have the technology to do it at the moment. And so the developing countries are going to be left behind again, okay? And so they're very unhappy about that and saying, look, we don't want to be left behind again. That's unfair. So this idea of common heritage of mankind says that, look, if you're going to exploit any resources on the deep seabed, in the case of Law of the Sea, and in the moon, in case of the Moon Treaty, then you've got to set up special rules, and this is in Article 11 of the Moon Treaty, set up special rules that doesn't stop developing countries being able to do it, but if they do it, they have to do it in a way that they share some of the benefits with the developing countries, okay? So in the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, which is 3 years later, in relation to the deep seabed, there's a whole part 11 in there about deep seabed mining, which is now becoming really relevant because there's going to be some deep seabed mining in the next three or 5 years, okay? It's just about to happen. It was put in 1982, it's just about to happen in the deep seabed. And when that happens, there are some mechanisms in there that allow some of the cream to be scooped off and to go to developing countries for technology transfer and some other things, okay? And there's the same idea here, okay? So if any spacefaring state, all developed states, get up into the moon and start wanting to mine rare earth minerals or water and split it to hydrogen or whatever else, there has to be a regime set up that allows for some of the cream of that activity to be scooped off and to put over to developing countries, so they're not left behind, okay? So that was the whole kind of logic of this common heritage of mankind principle, okay? It's actually just reared its head again. There was a treaty agreed earlier this year under the Law of the Sea Convention, a new treaty called the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. This is the water column in areas outside of national jurisdiction. It's to do with marine genetic resources. This is where ships go out on the ocean, scoop up marine life, and then they take it back to the lab and make drugs and pills and stuff out of it, right? So with that common heritage principle now applies to that as well, okay?
Marine prospecting with sonar or sonic sounds that destroy anything in quite a significant range, just to try and find resources under the sea.
No. This is more about if you get your ship, go out beyond 200 nautical miles, scoop up some weird jellyfish. You take it back to your scientists, and they say, "Oh, look at the blood of this jellyfish; it can cure cancer, right?" And then go away and put a patent on it. Let's make a fortune. It's that sort of thing, right? It's marine genetic resources. So if that happens, these days with these new rules, the big American or European company that discovers that can't keep all the benefits from it. There's got to be this kind of sharing going on, right? So this is the idea we got into the Moon Treaty, okay? Again, it's a developing world kind of equity claim against the West, essentially, right? And so it's in there, and it's never been set up because we don't have mining on the moon about to happen. If it's ever going to happen, then you need to set up under Article 11 a regime that will allow for that benefit sharing to developing countries, right? Doesn't go into exactly how that's going to occur, but the Part 11 of the Law of the Sea Convention is probably the model that would be looked to, or this Marine Genetic Resources provisions of the BB&J Treaty. That's what would be looked to, because they're the more modern examples of the way that can be done. Only trouble is, okay, countries in international law are only bound to treaties that they sign up to, okay? Of those 5 treaties I just ran through there, the 5 space law treaties, if we look at the Outer Space Treaty, the Constitution or the Bible of outer space law, you've got 112 states in it, including all the major space powers, okay? Great, okay? The other 70-odd countries that aren't in it, who cares? Then they're not getting into space anytime soon. All the major countries are in the Outer Space Treaty, good coverage, great, okay? The Rescue Agreement, 98 states, all major space powers, great. Liability Convention, 98 states, all major space powers, great. Registration Convention, 72 states, all major space powers, great. The Moon Treaty, 18 states, including Australia and 17 others, and none of them are major space powers. So all the major space powers haven't signed up to the Moon Treaty, so they're not bound by this common heritage of mankind principle if they want to mine on the moon. Okay, Australia is. It was the Hawke government that joined us in the early 80s, and they did it. I saw a good explanation of this the other day. They did it. What was the reason? It was was it to support the developing countries at the time? It was a kind of unusual reasons we kind of did it for. Was kind of, like it was the Hawke government kind of, oh, this is a good idea, we'll do this, and we've been in this, but we're not mining on the moon anytime soon, and the other 17 countries in it aren't either. Okay, so that's why China and that's why Russia and that's why France, Japan, these other sort of major countries that could actually do this technologically are interested in it, particularly with the rare earth minerals, with the batteries on electric cars and all this sort of stuff. That's why they want to mine the deep seabed, okay? And that's why they seriously talk about asteroid mining and moon mining. And they don't do it with a tongue in cheek. They actually are fairly serious about it. And it's allowable. It's not an appropriation under outer space law. And in fact, the Americans have passed domestic law. The Obama administration did this. It wasn't even Trump, which actually says that if an American company goes into space and brings stuff back to Earth to use, that the American company owns and can benefit from that. Okay, so they're given their company certainty that if they want to go mining, they can rely, at least under American law, that they will be protected under American law. Well, I mean, there's non-appropriation, so neither of them can rope off an area, but it's a bit of a free-for-all in that sense. Whoever gets there first and gets in is allowed to, and the other one can go next door and extract away as well. Okay. The water. Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't think I was really sure how much there is. It's in as I understand, in caves on the southern pole area, and they haven't explored it very well because humans haven't really, have hardly been back to the moon. No. Yeah. Yeah. Look, strictly speaking, shouldn't do that. Yeah, that For All Mankind show on Apple TV. It's about 4 or 5 series. It's a fantastic show. I really recommend it. But it proceeds on the basis that the Outer Space Treaty didn't exist, right? So there's the second series is all about militarization of moon bases, and there's fighting between the Soviets and the Americans. Very, very minor, but it's sort of militarized. And then the mining, that they get seriously into mining of the water. And there is a bit of conflict over that as well, and competition over that. And I think, at one point, I think the Americans and the Soviets divide the moon in half. They say that's half yours and this half is ours. So so it's that whole series sort of is a counterfactual history, which an alternate history when these rules didn't get agreed. Okay, and it sort of shows the way things could have happened if these rules didn't get agreed, and the Soviet Union didn't fall over. In that, the Soviet Union kind of keeps going, and there's into the 2020s, or it's up to 2030s, where it's up to now. So so it is really interesting. If you've got Apple TV, I really recommend it. Anyway, so that's my my material. That's the last slide. But happy to answer any questions about any of that. Yeah.
And also the situation of bringing material back to Earth is obviously putting Earth at risk. So therefore, is there anything in the treaties that stop them from bringing it on back? So for instance, they're going to Mars, they're going to bring back all this stuff. What are they bringing back, etc. So
no, they're both good questions. Look, in terms of who's watching, right? There is no international intergalactic police force up there watching what states are doing in orbit and on the moon, of course. So and this is one of the problems, of course, with the deep seabed as well. Antarctica to an extent as well. It's hard. These are hard places to watch. Self-administered, or if states see another state doing something that's against the rules, then they're in breach of the treaty, and the state then can bring action for breach of international law in an international court or tribunal. That's the the end point. But usually the way things are dealt with is informally, in the sense that if I'm a country, I see you breaching the rules, first thing I do is diplomatically approach you and say, what the hell are you doing? You're breaching the rules. And then you say, I'm not breaching the rules because I interpret the rules this way. And then there's an argument about who's breaching the rules. So it's usually done diplomatically, okay, through behind the scenes. I mean, so say for instance, no, but luckily, you don't usually get pure obstinacy. I mean, even the Soviets with that satellite that came back, they were not on good terms with the Canadians at the time. But they didn't just, turn their back and go, oh, we're not paying anything here, go to hell. They, ended up settling it for half its value. So but most times, countries see the long-term benefits of a stable order and a stable system of rules. So they don't tend to place their immediate short-term interest to the detriment of that long-term system. Okay. Mind you, the Ukraine-Russia example at the moment is probably an example where you are seeing that. So, but that's kind of unusual. The post World War II history of the last 60 or 70 years, these sorts of incidences are the exception rather than the rule. Oh, yeah, look, there is a capacity when you sign on to treaties to actually reserve in relation to some provisions, okay? So you can opt out of some provisions. If you opt out of too many, then they go, oh, no, you're not really joining the treaty, so go away. But no, there is some capacity. But look, in terms of the Outer Space Treaty, the fact that they haven't agreed on the definition between domestic airspace and outer space doesn't really affect 99% of the way it operates. It's just it's more this problem of weather balloons and things between say 25 kilometres and 100 kilometres, and do we apply outer space law? Do we apply the outer space law there or domestic law? Okay, but in terms of most of the stuff I talked about there, in most instances that's not going to be a problem. But it's the other side, people students get frustrated. I know at university when you're teaching this stuff. Oh, why don't they just agree on that? Or why is there a lack of clarity about that? The answer is, to get 192 countries around a table and get them to agree on just about anything is a major feat of diplomacy. You know what I mean? So you've got, and it might be a subset of them here, but back in, might have been 15, 20 countries, but even to get 15 or 20 countries to agree on things is difficult. Everything is contested. Yeah, I just can't remember off the top of my head that the Americans do have a reason for 88 kilometres. I don't think it's the limit of their jet aircraft. I think even those high altitude jet aircraft only go to about 60 kilometres.
They work in miles. If you try to be exactly so many miles.
It is in miles in the conversion. Yeah, it's 50 miles, which is 88 kilometres. There's some reason they go for 50 miles. I just can't remember off the top of my head what it is. But it's So and the Soviets have always said 25 kilometres because the feeling was, that they like the idea of being able to get down low and spy, and so no, we're in space, we're at 30 kilometres, with a balloon or whatever. So and so we've got freedom of movement. But I mean, for spying purposes now, I mean, satellites are so good with their surveillance techniques and their cameras. So whether you're down, at 30 kilometres in a weather balloon, or whether you're up at 200 kilometres with a really good camera. Yeah, you do get that. Yeah, exactly. You get an entrenched position, and countries don't want to move from it. Yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, sorry. Look, in terms of the outer space treaties, there's nothing specific on that, and it is a a biosecurity risk, in the sense that you never know what you're digging up and bringing back. So that's all dealt with under domestic law and domestic protocols that countries put into place themselves. And sadly, at the moment, there's not any international agreement as to the content of those domestic rules. Okay, and that's something that countries are agitating within. It's called UCOPUS. It's the UN Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, or UCOPUS. They meet every year. There's an ongoing dialogue at the UN General Assembly meeting in September. They meet and they discuss. Yeah, so that's one of the issues that's under discussion. The other one, space debris. And I know you very concerned about all these microsatellites. These lines of Musk and other satellites going over. Yeah, so that there's space debris and the risk of collision, and that Kessler effect, that if you get one satellite bumps into another and fragments and then bumps into more and fragments, you can end up with this sort of chain reaction of space debris. Trying to avoid that sort of risk. So that's the other one that's a big topic of conversation, along with mining.
Last year, the Russians actually shot one of their own satellites. They aimed at, remember this? Talk on that.
Yeah.
One of their generals was very proud of the accuracy of this shot, but debris could have hit the International Space Station.
Yes.
And other satellites have caused a series of catastrophic, out of orbit. Other satellites.
Yeah.
Does that automatically mean that they have to abide by treaties that the US has signed?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And so you read some of these entrepreneurs. They're so, big-headed in some ways and so powerful. They sometimes talk as if they're a law unto themselves. No, they're not. All companies in the United States are subject to United States law. The United States law, under their launch obligations under space law, is in domestic law. So those companies have to go through all that US domestic law in order to launch. Okay, so they're bound by US domestic law, which implements US obligations under the Outer Space Treaty. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Like, that they don't do that sort of thing to say, well, you can get around it by letting them shop at a, I don't know, Guatemala or something.
Yeah, no, not a big problem. Luckily, that that they want to launch from countries that are fairly technologically savvy.
And I'm conscious that we're going over time.
Yes,
So
yes.
what about Space Force and the Trump administration?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or
That's
do we need to get you back again next year?
no. Space Force. There's the Netflix series with Steve Carell. Yeah.
Like the uniforms the president's wife designed.
Yeah, so that was Trump, Trump 1.0. We might have Trump 2.0 at the end of the year. But Trump 1.0, yes, he set up Space Force as a kind of command within the US military. So, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and yeah, this is Space Force. So, okay, and everyone went, tongue in cheek, oh, that's really, funny, and Trump, this is Trump. But in fact, that had been coming for some time. The Americans had wanted to set up, American military wanted to set up its own command. And we have one here as well. The Australian military has a Space Command. It's not a separate branch of the military, but it's within Air Force, I think. So we have our own sort of smaller version of that. Most of the key countries now, advanced military countries do. But it's all to do with, the use of satellites for military command control communication systems, being able to protect your own satellites from being killed, and being shot down, disabled. Because basically the whole, of any sophisticated military, including the US military, all runs off satellites. Okay, so there's the first shots in any World War III, they reckon, will come in space, not on Earth, because it'll be the taking out of communication satellites. Yeah, but remember the treaty. No, non-militarization provisions only say you don't put weapons of mass destruction in space or in orbit or on other planets. They don't say anything about military command control communication systems or taking out those from the ground. So, you could use a laser or a missile, which is what you were talking about, to take out satellites from the ground. That's not a breach of the treaty. Okay?
Well, in Space Command, I always think of marionettes.
Thunderbirds. Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right. Is there any other questions for Jeff? He probably needs a drink of water after.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer any further questions over coffee or So
Yeah.
anyway, hopefully that was interesting, and thanks for the opportunity to have a chat to you.
Oh no, it's been wonderful. Thank you. All right, so we'll just have a quick break and get a quick cuppa, and then we'll come back in 10 minutes or so, and Richard will do his tour of the night skies for next month.
Thanks, Matty. All right, I'll get this. Oh, that's the running chicken, by the way, Lambda Centauri Nebula, for those who are curious, but in hydrogen, sulfur, oxygen palette. So, which wasn't because I had those filters, but it was just a trick of software. But when you do that, you see a lot more detail in the nebula than you do. Yeah, you can see, and it gives a 3D effect. It's quite interesting. Anyway, we'll get underway. What have I done with it? Here we go. Okay. Hopefully this will work. A bit of mood music, just soften the audience a bit. Okay, so I thought I'd concentrate on July and August. There's something funny about sometimes it does that, PowerPoint. Anyway, let's have a look at what we can see in the next couple of months. So looking north, dominated by a ficus. Now, my last talk, I did a lot on Sagittarius and Scorpius. Scorpius before that, then Sagittarius. And now Sagittarius, of course, is up here, up to the right, up here somewhere, and to the left and above a ficus. Ficus, you all know what the ficus is? Does anyone know what that means, a ficus? The serpent bearer, the carrier of the snake. So on this side is the snake's tail, serpent's cauda, and on this side is the snake's head. The triangle represents the snake's head. So it curls around, that's his waist, and then he just vanishes into Sagittarius and Scorpius. So that's straight above. So Scorpius is really high. This is, by the way, I should explain. So remembering that stars move 4 minutes a day, so 2 hours a month. So, there's going to be quite a shift in the sky in the next, by the time you get to see this. no, I just don't like that screen. It drives me cranky. Anyway, down at the bottom is Hercules. Now, we don't normally talk about Hercules, but what famous object is in Hercules? Well, we'll come to that in a sec. Let's first go over here to the left. You see Bootes, the herdsman, constellation of Bootes. Brightest star is Arcturus. That star is a 3. That is a giant star. It's a giant star. It's a red giant. Going into a red giant phase. A beautiful, it's a K class star. K 1.5, I think it is, something like that. So it's very red, and hopefully I've got a picture of it. And it's 35 times the size of the sun. 35 times that. It's 7 billion years old, and it's about, I think from memory, 37 light years away from us. So it's a very close star. Now, down here is a spectacular object, M13. What's M13? A globular cluster. That's right, a very famous one, the most famous one in the Northern Hemisphere, but a bit ho-hum compared to some of ours, frankly. I mean, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Are there any Americans here? Sorry, it is a bit ho-hum. I mean, they're nice pictures. It's a nice globular, but it's not spectacular when you compare it to Omega Centauri or the even brighter and very bright 47 Tucanae. So down here also is Cabalri. Now, Cabalri is part of the Beta AFCIG. So, and it is a red star as well. And in fact, it's the same spectral class as Arcturus, but a younger, but on the same evolutionary stage. That is, it's burned up a lot of its hydrogen, converted to helium, so now it's at that swelling stage, which is what's going to happen to our sun on a longer time frame. Now, here is some interesting I'm just going to look at quickly. So next to Cabalri is this beautiful little cluster, IC 4665, which I'll talk about in a moment. And over here are 2 clusters that I have mentioned last year, Tweedledum and Tweedledee. So here they are here, Tweedledum, and this is Tweedledee, and they're next to each other. Beautiful, beautiful double cluster. In fact, when you look at it, especially through a pair of binoculars, it reminds you of the Perseus double cluster. Have you heard of that one, the famous one in the Northern Hemisphere? The Perseus double cluster, it looks just the same. They're very close together. And finally, here, there is something strange at the end of that little arrow. Does anyone know what it is? Now, I'll give you the Latin term that's often used. Velox, Latin for fast, speedy. The speedy one of Barnard star, which is the fastest moving star in terms of proper motion that has been recorded. And it's, I'll come to that shortly and we'll talk about it. I don't know what's going funny about, oh, maybe, sorry, just for a minute. I've got an idea. Just for a minute, I will, that might help transitions from current slide. Sorry, transitions from slide. Yeah, no, here it is, from current slide. Right. Sorry, I'm just seeing if that's caused. Oh, it helped a bit. Okay, why have I got that here? I just put it up there, not to gratuitously show you the shapes of the constellations from Stellarium, but there's an odd thing there. Can you notice it? Oh, I hadn't noticed it before, because, you know, you think a constellation... Sorry? No. The unusual thing here is, you know, the first 48 constellations appeared in Ptolemy's Almagest, right? So 3rd century AD, 2nd century AD. Hercules is upside down. So for us, it's the right way up. All the other things are upside down. Now, the only other exceptions are, to the right, Pegasus, and Andromeda is sort of horizontal. Now, okay, you can say, well, all constellations, you know, especially those close to the pole, they're going to be upside down eventually, like the Southern Cross and everything else that's circumpolar. But this is not circumpolar. So when it was drawn, when it was designed upside down. It was drawn upside down. So whoever drew it Ptolemy, presumably, and before him, who was the other guy? Hipparchus, maybe. Drew it so that it was, they saw the figure, but the wrong way up. I just think that's funny. You know, maybe it's on holiday. But anyway, I just thought that, I only put that up there just to show you what those things look like. So, yeah. Okay, now here's that beautiful cluster, 4665, that was pointed out in Ophiuchus. 40 million years old and about 1,1400 light years away. We can't really tell, but a beautiful cluster of nights. So I promised you I would talk about things that were more to do with observing and looking through telescopes rather than taking photos. So this is a picture from 2022 of Comet Penstars going through it. There's a nice little tighter grouping of it. Visible binoculars and telescopes. So that's a really good one to look at. And there's a shot of it using, this is just a model diagram, using my telescope and a 31 Hyperion, giving you a field of view of 2.5 degrees. And this thing is, what is it? The width is 25 arc seconds, which is not quite half a degree, not quite the size of the moon. So it's not a bad sized cluster. So it occupies 5 into that is 0.5, so it's about half a degree. So it's, you can fit, it's about 1/5 of the field of view. This is low magnification, so 28 times. Nice way to look at a cluster. I would always use more, if it's a dense cluster, I'd definitely use high magnification because the innate brightness of the cluster will not dissipate with high magnification. Whereas if it's a dim one, that's, you know, it's not worth doing the high magnification. Anyway, thought I'd share that one with you. So that's a nice one. I think it's called the Black Swallowtail Cluster. It's got several different names as well. Now here's Barnard's Star. Now this is upside down, of course, because Cabal Ray on the right there is on the left normally, and the IC 4665, which we just looked at, is straight underneath it. So Barnard's Star is to the right of that, next to the star 66 Ophiuchi, and some interesting things about it. It's a red dwarf star. But its proper motion is, this was discovered by the guy who explored and mapped all the dark nebulae that we have in the galaxy. Remember Barnard? Barnard's, yeah, all the objects are Barnard. Barnard this, Barnard that, Barnard 33, you've heard of these, I'm sure. So, named after him, E. Barnard. So he using plates, he actually mapped the speed of the thing as 10.3 arc seconds per year, which is a lot of movement for a star. And it's 6 light years away. It's one of the closest, 10 closest stars. After this, I think it's Wolf 356, and there are a couple of others. So anyway, back to the not so fantastic, but pretty good globular cluster M13. Now, has anyone looked at it at all? If Steve was here, probably almost certainly has. Since you've seen just about everything in the night sky. But this is quite a sizable cluster. In fact, 168 light years across, 300 to almost 500,000 stars, 300,000 to 500,000 stars. And a magnitude of 5.8, that makes it pretty bright. However, it is low, so you'd be looking through a lot of atmosphere murkiness to look at it. So it would cause a bit of extinction of the light. But not too much, still a bright object. Now, why did I put that up there? Because in 1974, do you remember the big Arecibo telescope which collapsed in a heap last year or the year before? They're never going to repair it. It was destroyed. It's a wreck. But in 1974, on its inauguration or shortly after, they did some adjustments to it. And to celebrate it, they launched a signal out into space carrying coded messages about human DNA and their location and other things. And this went out into space. So this was a transmitter, not a receiver, a transmitted signal. And it went out, the cluster, it was aimed at the Hercules cluster. But the cluster has its own relative velocity, speaking crudely. It's moving itself in the arm of the galaxy. And so because this thing is at a distance of, 22,000, some places say 25,000 light years, the thing will have moved out of the way and the signal will continue across the universe to wherever, probably out into intergalactic space. So, so it's not going to get where it's supposed to be. Ironically, the globular cluster M13, at which the signal was aimed, won't be there when the message arrives. Its radial velocity, I think that's a mistake. It should be 244 kilometres per second. Mind you, that in itself is a strange thing to measure, because in globular clusters, a lot of the stars have got differential velocities. Just because they're in a big ball and gravitational attractor doesn't mean they're all travelling at the same speed. They're not, and there are other forces at work which can cause them to, you know, not destabilise, but yeah, they like an open cluster will eventually disappear because of other forces. So anyway, but anyone in the target area when the signal arrives could detect it with a radio telescope of similar size, and it would appear, now get this, at 10 million times the intensity of the normal radio signals from our sun. So they'll know it's artificial. Well, they should do. Anyway, so there you go. I thought I'd put that in there because I thought that was very interesting, a little thing about that. So here's Tweedledum and Tweedledee now, those two clusters. You can see what I mean when I say they're like, this is Tweedledee. You can see what I mean when I say they're like the Perseus cluster, because they look just the same in the northern hemisphere, the double cluster. So that's a picture of it there. Large in Serpens. Now, Serpens cauda, Serpens tail. Now, this would be a beautiful object to look at. Magnitude 4.6, that makes it really bright. Any pair of binoculars will find it, or a small telescope, and give you a spectacular view, visible to the naked eye. 1,300 light years away, that makes it about the same distance as the Orion Nebula. 24 arc minutes, that's quite a sizable cluster, and 50 to 100 stars. Tweedledum, on the other hand, is more spread out, but still lots of young blue stars. So these are hot stars formed out of the same gas cloud, because that's what happens with open clusters, formed in the same, same molecular cloud. Now, Tweedledum is a bit closer, 1,000 light years away, as opposed to 1,300, and it contains about 30 young hot stars, and it's about 600 million years old. There are some clusters that are, there's one that's about 1 billion or 2 billion years old. That's exceptional for an open cluster. Yes? No, they're the nicknames people have given. They're not officially. The IAU wouldn't accept Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Well, we could ring up Martin and find out, but I'll bet you anything they don't. So they just accept the index catalogue number or the NGC number as the official thing. Yeah, so this is in a this cluster. These two are in a ficus, not in Serpens. So now that's what they look like. That's the field of view when you look through a pair of binoculars. So it's actually better to look through a pair of binoculars than it would be through a telescope, unless you're using very low power on a telescope. That's a 7x50 pair of binoculars. So exopupil, we all know about the exopupil. So 7mm cone of light coming out of the eyepiece, out of the binocular, which you can easily work out because all you do is divide that into that. 7 into 50 gives you 7mm. No good for old folks like me, but quite good for people who are young, whose pupil can dilate 7mm and get a brilliant view. Yes?
Given that they're both so close together, whoever first catalogued them by the different catalogue numbers or names,
Yeah.
they're classified by different people.
Yes.
Why would that be the case? Both reasonably easy to identify.
Just
low power.
Different times, I think, Chris, that's all. Who is it? Louis Dreyer, who did the index catalogue? And I forget the guy who did the New General. Someone did the... one of them is by Louis Dreyer. I'm sure his name is Dreyer, D-R-E-Y-E-R, who did one catalogue. They've all got different catalogues. That's why when you get atlases, they've got, you know, umpteen names and catalogue numbers, because people at different times have catalogued, maybe for certain properties. You know, I'm going to do star clusters and focus on that. You know, so the index catalogue is full of star clusters. But not necessarily.
Classify NGC 663, vice versa.
Yeah, but I've never. Sometimes you see IC and NGC, but more often you don't. There's one or the other. But there are other things like Colander, Caldwell, are common cataloguers as well by different astronomers, Caldwell and Colander. Dunlop, of course, you know, the Australian astronomer, and so on.
Close together. These are
Yeah,
the-
you'd think so.
You would think, as Chris is trying to say,
Yeah.
the same person that saw one would see the other and would name both of them at the same time.
Yes.
So when you
I agree.
when you
But
refer
it-
to one,
Yeah.
One has to play other.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So,
One, because like distance, age, whatever, that one was more visible. Maybe one was catalogued first because it was more visible than the other at that particular
well,
time.
some of these things have definitely appeared at different times, have been catalogued at very different time periods. There's no doubt about that. It's just like the constellations. So the 48 originals had 40, another 40 added by people like Lalonde and Louis de Lacaille especially, and a few other scientists, astronomers who have added names. So I guess the cataloguing would be the same thing. Yeah, same thing would happen. Gee, that's contrasty, that picture. Okay, so why have I got? So let's look east. So we've got Sagittarius up the top, of course, the centre of the galaxy. Scutum. Now, what's Scutum? Shield. Yep, shield. Now, we're going to look at a couple of things here. And Vulpecula. Anyone remember what Vulpecula is? The fox. Very good. You get a chocolate. Now, there is something very interesting in Vulpecula, a planetary nebula. Can you see it? Does anyone know what that is? I'll show you this in a moment. Firstly, let's look up here, the wild duck cluster. We're going to look at that. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Now, years ago, Stefan pointed this out to me. I had no idea it existed, but it's the most spectacularly dense cluster you can look at. I'll show you some pictures of it in a moment. Down here, now C stands for Caldwell, so it's a catalogue, Caldwell catalogue. There is also CR, which is short for Colander. So if you see CR, it's Colander, different person. So the Helix Nebula, which we've all looked at before, well, we've all talked about and tried to take photos of. Now, the Helix Nebula is a planetary nebula, so it's a star that's, like our sun, has reached the end of its life, and eventually, at the middle of it, so it goes to a sort of nova and expels gas, and ends up, the middle of it is a white dwarf, which is scarcely bigger than the Earth, but has the density of the sun compressed into that very small space. So super dense, and it's very white and very hot, and it could be 80 to 100,000 degrees at first, but then it just cools down. Now, the thing about white dwarfs is they're dead. They're not generating heat and light, even though they're so bright and hot. They're actually, it's like turning a heater off. They're just cooling down. And they'll take a billion, 2 billion, 3 billion years to cool down, and then they'll become a black dwarf. And that's what's going to happen to our sun. So they say. So over here, the dumbbell, M27. M stands for Messier, Messier's catalogue, Charles Messier, the Frenchman. So those three, let's look at those three objects just quickly as we speed through. We haven't got many slides. The wild duck cluster, look at that. Isn't that spectacular? Now, a bit dazzling because that's a long exposure photograph with, I think, the 2.2 metre La Silla telescope in Chile. From memory, one of them is anyway. And that's a close-up of the middle of the cluster. Isn't it spectacular? Rather gorgeous. Beautiful thing, beautiful thing. So another different shot. Brighter stars, more V-shaped, look like a flock of ducks, but some people say it's one duck swimming along. You know, it's fanned out like this, and there's its neck and its head. I don't know, bit of wild imagination. Yeah, I'm not going to do, no, this is not charades. Anyway, it sort of looks more obvious here because the star is a bit more suppressed here, but it's flying down southwest. Okay. Beautiful cluster. That is worth looking at through binoculars and telescopes. So that's one to note down. I think it's one of the most spectacular ones available in the sky at the moment. Now, this is my picture of the Helix Nebula. Remember the Helix Nebula? You know, which is planetary nebula in Aquarius, Aquarius is rising now, becoming more prominent. 25 arc minutes, so it's almost the size of the moon, magnitude 7.6. Apparently, you can see some mistiness in that through a telescope, but it says you can see it in binoculars, but boy, it'd be a dot because it's small. and it might say 25 arc minutes, but in fact, that's sort of going to the outer edges, and the intensity of the light, when they say magnitude 7.6, that's a bit deceptive, because what they do is they take the whole thing and compress it into a point and say it's like a magnitude 7.6 star. So that means it's going to be very faint. So when you look through binoculars, it's going to be very, very faint, even if you've got powerful binoculars, even if you've got a decent-sized telescope. You need a light bucket to see it properly. So a 10, 12-inch telescope would show something. A Dobsonian, maybe, would show you a nice view of this. So that's been taken with a small telescope. This has been taken with the Spitzer Space Telescope, which was decommissioned in 2020. And that is a gorgeous picture, and that's why they call it the Eye of Sauron, because it does look like the Eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Isn't it? You can see the benefits of infrared, because you can see through dust and you can see underlying structures. Now, if you look at this carefully, can you see these little streaky lights? Right, they're pods or globules. We're going to just mention those. They're covered in what they call cometary knots or globules. Now, this thing is called the Eye of God or the Eye of Sauron, and here are those little things there. That's what they look like. And they appear in most of the major planetary nebulae. They're a part of the process of the star having expelled its material. And they appear radially away from the star in the middle, the white dwarf. So, and there's a picture of what it would look like. Now, the red frame suggests this is for camera work. So, I'm using my telescope sorry? No, that's my old camera. I put that there deliberately because this is APS-C mode. Aha. So an APS-C shot through my 819 millimeter focal length telescope gives you that size picture, which is great. That's enough you could take that, do 2 or 3 hours, enlarge it, crop it, and you get a decent image. So you don't need a whopping great telescope focal length to do it. But through a Schmidt-Cassegrain, an 8-inch or a 9 1/4, you get it would fill the frame because you've got 2,400 millimeter focal length. Yeah, I think that's a beauty. I think it's a good target. I mean, if you can get that out of a small telescope, what can you get out of a longer focal length? Now, I put this up here because there's a video I came across. I love this, to show you those little globules. And that's at invisible light. And then infrared. Look at the difference. So infrared shows you all the structures. Remember that beautiful shot of the Horsehead Nebula in infrared light? Have you ever seen that? And it's transparent. And all that black has gone, and you've got this beautiful, goes right through the dust. And you see these wonderful structures in the gas. Anyway, I think that's very interesting. Who knows what James Webb will uncover? Anyway, here's the Dumbbell Nebula, the third one. Now, some people call it the apple core nebula. I relate more to the apple core than the dumbbell. To me, it looks like an apple core. In Vulpecula, which is the Fox, as we said, same distance away as the Orion Nebula, 8 by 5.6. Now, this is smaller than the other one. This is a tiny one, okay, really tiny planetary nebula. 9,807 years old, maybe. Some people say it could be up to 14,000 years old. The helix, the ring, and the dumbbell contain those globules that we looked at, all of them. Dark and bright cusp knots, particularly in the central region. The progenitor star, that is this one, right there, is a white dwarf, about 5% of the sun size and half its mass. So that's quite a big white dwarf. Anyway, that's a picture, another picture, I forget which one that came from. And this is one I've never seen before. But look at the structures in that. It looks quite different. And that's what it would look like if you looked at, what is it? How many magnifications have I got there? 117. And of course, you wouldn't see much at all. Sorry? Yes, very much like an apple core. But you could, yeah, a toffee apple core. That's 170 magnifications. You wouldn't see much. Sounds great. You magnify, and of course, inverse square law, you're spreading light over a larger area because you're magnifying it, and so it's looking very, very faint. So you wouldn't see too much. But still interesting to look at and to look for. Now, looking south. I've done the southern sky to death this year, so I'm not going to concentrate on the familiar stuff. We've done all of this or covered a lot of it. But what I thought I'd do is look at a couple of interesting things. Down here is a galaxy which I've taken one subframe of. It's quite bright, NGC 55. And the other one down here, NGC 300, which Stellarium mistakenly calls the southern pinwheel. It's not the southern pinwheel at all, which is M83. It's just called the something else pinwheel. It's not the southern pinwheel. So let's have a look at these two. Just up here, I've got the name of it here. Now, the 55, I call it the whale, but it's called the String of Pearls galaxy. But that is really, really bright. And I have no doubt that a good small telescope would show you a lot of this interesting object. In fact, Eugene, I think we only took 2-minute subs of that or something, and it was as bright as anything. Really visible. Yeah, it's a whopper. So look, 32 by 5 arc minutes. So that's even bigger than the moon. A Magellanic type barred spiral. I think this is the one that's got one arm. They reckon it's got one arm. A distance 6.5 million light years away. So it's part of our, one of our close neighbours. 70,000 light years across, magnitude 7.87, and about 20 billion solar masses. Now that is a very interesting object to look out for. Burnham, good old Robert Burnham. Remember that scientist who died destitute ended up who wrote those beautiful celestial handbooks. What a terrible story that was, his life story. Anyway, who's got Burnham's celestial handbook? I had it. I don't know what I've done with it. The 3 volumes. He's the only scientist I've ever come across who adds that beautiful sort of romantic insight into what he's looking at. You can see the beauty in things, and his descriptions are so vivid. But anyway, he calls it one of the outstanding galaxies of the southern heavens. Yeah, it sure is. Now, this one, the other one. Now, I've taken a picture of this under murky conditions, so I'm going to film it again. This is actually quite big. The Sculptor, sorry, that's what I was trying to think of. Sculptor pinwheel, not southern pinwheel, as Stellarium calls it. Again, 6 million light years. So what can you infer about these two? They're going to tidally interact because they're so close together. They reckon they're affecting each other. Right? 300 billion solar masses, one of the closest to the local group, and probably lies between the latter and the Sculptor group. So these are sort of between us. Now, you've got the local group is there, us, Andromeda, the Magellanic Clouds, that kind of sculptural group, NGC 253, which, the sculptural galaxy, and these guys. So there you go, gravitationally bound pair. With the magnitude down here, this is quite bright, 9. It's actually pretty bright. A short exposure of a minute or two on a cooled camera will give you an interesting sub. You can see the outlines of the galaxy already. So it's quite good. So if you go up to about magnitude 9 and you've got a camera, you're going to pick it up pretty well. It's only when you get to magnitude 11 or 12, things are very difficult then. And you need hours and hours of exposure. So there's 55, the String of Pearls galaxy, seen at a magnification of 43 times. So keep it low and keep it bright. So that's not a bad size. You probably keep that in the field of view for a while and have a sticky beak. And the exopupil is nearly 3 millimeters. So that kind of light, get that in the center of your eye, and you should have a good time if you're in a comfortable chair. And there it looks, that's what it looks like through a C8, an APS-C sensor. So quite big, isn't it? I mean, that's the actual size. So there you go, Roscoe. Your next target, NGC 300. Even in my Big Bertha, the refractor, it's only 1200 mil focal length. It's a decent size at APS-C to do things with. So there's APS-C, Celestron 8 HD, that is. So 9.25, you wouldn't fit it in, would you? You reckon, Eugene? It'd be pretty, it'd be massive. Yeah, it'd be gorgeous. Especially that 62 megapixel camera. Yeah. Well, now here's using one of my, I've got a Teleview IPS 24 mil. It's still a nice size. That's a magnification of 34. So keeping your magnification low, because it's a galaxy, you would still get a nice bright little smudge. But you'd have to sit there and let your eyes get adjusted and look at it for a while. But you'd probably pick up some of the spiral structure if you looked at it long enough. I'm sure you would. Now, just quickly, looking south, Centaurus. Looking south again. NGC 5128 is? The numbers don't roll off the tongue. This is Centaurus A, the Hamburger galaxy. Remember? Centaurus A. A very strong radio source. And so that's up there. And the other one, which we'll come across, there it is. Now, I've got a picture. I wish it was like this. It's got a supermassive black hole, 50 million solar masses now. There's dark lane here. Lisa's got a gorgeous picture of Centaurus A. And Lisa picked up some of this blue, which I thought was amazing. I didn't pick up the blue, but it's got a radio jet that's, I'll show you the notes, it's amazing. It's got an X-ray jet, which is thousands of light years long because of the black hole. And it's got 1 million light year long, what is it? X-ray jets, 1,000 light year, radio jets. So, radio, 1 million light years long. I mean, that's extraordinary. So that's a supermassive black hole in the middle of it causing all that. It's not too far away, 11 to 13 million light years. So, it's not as far as a lot of galaxies. Magnitude 6.84, that makes it bright, but it is small. It says 25 by 20, but it doesn't, when you look through it, it's a pretty faint little object. You'd be lucky to see the little burger in the middle. It is faint. What's that measure they use? Surface brightness. So many per square pixel, no, square arc second. The magnitude per arc second, per square arc second. And they're usually around 20, magnitude 20. So in other words, that's a measure of a chunk of that galaxy is at 20th magnitude to look at with the naked eye, which is extremely faint. So, I mean, a telescope will help you, obviously, but it's going to be very faint. You need a camera. All you'd see is this little bit here, the dark lane most people see. That's all I've ever seen anyway of it. And there's, of course, what's that famous object? Da, da, da. No? Yes, it's Omega Centauri. The two are close together. In fact, I think this one is about 7 or 8 degrees away from that. It's not too far. So that's Omega Centauri. Now, we all know what a beautiful object this is to look at and worth keeping in mind when you're staring at the southern sky and you've got nothing to look at. At the moment, the Southern Cross has culminated. It's going down on the right-hand side, and that means that Omega Centauri is getting lower and lower, which is perfect. So it won't be so low that it'll be lost in the mist. It's high enough to be seen clearly through a telescope or a pair of binoculars. But this is an object you need to get to look at for a while to pick up the stars because it's so elusive. It's big, you can see, but it's elusive. 10 million stars. I think it's about 17,000 light years away, something like that. I can't remember the exact number. There it is, 17,000 light years. Magnitude 3.9, 100 light years. Yeah, 10 million stars. It's a spectacular object. At the middle, the stars are only 0.1 light years apart. 1/10 of a light year. Imagine living in the middle of that. They reckon they can't have solar systems in the middle of a globular cluster because of the tidal forces of the stars upon each other. The gravitational interaction would prevent a stable solar system from existing. Sorry? Yes, that's right. After they book the 3-body problem. This is many body problems. Anyway, I thought I'd show you a little trick. So to find this, measure the distance from there to there, 2.5 degrees between Mi and Gamma Crucis, so Epsilon and Delta in the Southern Cross, and go up there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that distance. That's about 13 degrees. So, and there you've got a bit over 13, I think, about 14. But anyway, a straight line, and you get to Centaurus A. Then all you do is dog leg to the right of 7 or 8 degrees, and you've got the other one. So they're close to each other. So remember that little trick. Now, there's my picture of Centaurus A. What's missing? I didn't get the blue. See the blue? No blue. But I did get some of those jets coming off the side. Yeah. Ah, it's a beautiful thing. That needs hours of exposure, though. Yeah, look, I know. I keep looking at that. You mean this thing up here? Yeah, well, there's a, you know what that looks like? That looks like almost like gravitational lensing to me, but I'm not sure. Oh, I might have got some gravitational lensing in there. Anyway, lastly, west. What can you see in the west? Well, you've got the real southern pinwheel galaxy up there, M83, which we all like and which I'm going to try and get photos of this year. A beautiful, beautiful, beautiful galaxy, which is sort of face onto us, so it's worth 40,000, 15 million light years, worth 7.6. That makes it, by galaxy standards, that's really bright. One of the brightest galaxies in the night sky. A pair of binoculars will pick it up. 13 minutes by 11 minutes, 11 and a half minutes. A decent object, and there it is at looking at 41 magnification. So it's a little blob at 41, yeah, but you'd still get a bright little spiral picture. So that's using a 20mm eyepiece and an 819mm refractor. Now, photographically, here it is using a Celestron 9¼ that's a beauty. Southern pinwheel is a beauty in a 9¼ It fills the frame. You don't have to do much enlargement there. In fact, you wouldn't want to. I mean, you need a bit of space around it. So I think that's an exciting thing to take photos of. Anyone guess what this one is down near Virgo? So the Virgo supercluster, which was down here, has disappeared with Leo. Leo's gone, or going. By this time of night, it's already well and truly gone. So you've got the Virgo supercluster. This is? No, that's gone with it. No, this is Sombrero. There. So the Sombrero galaxy. Now, reasonably bright. You get the dark lane. Some people call this the hamburger as well. 105. This is the size of our galaxy, same size. But they reckon, yeah, so all the interesting stuff is happening in the disk. There's very little happening in the middle, apparently. Magnitude 8, 9/4, so that is a small galaxy. But still, magnitude 8, that's quite bright. What does it say? The dust lane is actually a symmetrical ring that encloses the bulge of the galaxy and contains most of its cold atomic hydrogen gas and dust. Now, it has between 1,200 to 2,000 globular clusters, whereas we have 150. And it's the same size galaxy as ours. Interesting how things form. And that concludes. I cannot resist laughing cartoons, I'm sorry. Oh dear. It sort of segued nicely, Jeff, from what you were talking about, missiles and rockets. Thank you. Lights on. That's it, guys. I'm sorry, I for this month anyway. So any questions about any of that stuff? Those clusters that I mentioned, though, are really worth looking at. Look beautiful through telescopes, you know. We've got to get back to our roots and stop taking photos so much. Or at least I'm talking about myself. And start looking again at those gorgeous. They look spectacular. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's a draw card. That's a draw. I'm jealous. It's such a draw card, you know. Everyone gravitates towards it. No, it's a lovely thing. It is good fun, isn't it? Yeah. A lot of those things you can see with binoculars, though. If you haven't got the dough, if you want, there are some beautiful binoculars about now. I might even do a talk on binoculars sometime because I've been looking at them. Very interesting. You know, $700 will get you, I think, Monarch HG binoculars, which are very good. And, you know, if you want to spend $2,200, you can buy the Canon image stabilized binoculars, which have got rave reviews, and they've got super ED glass in them. So they're as good as a telescope, any of the best telescope, handheld, no jitters, for nervy old people, like some of us are. But you can hold them and...
Yeah, I wouldn't say it would be that good picture because camera that have physical cameras, yeah, they will stabilize the image
yeah,
to a certain extent, but
not forever. Yeah, you still shake a bit. Yeah, but you know, I think they've got a 10 by 50 set and an a 7 or 8 by 50. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.